College, a time to find yourself, make lifelong friends, and prepare for the future. It's supposed to be an adventure of discovery, a place to grow and thrive. But for some students, it's where their worst nightmares begin. Imagine waking up to find your roommate staring at you while you sleep, or hearing strange tapping on your dorm room door night after night, only to find no one there. What about being followed through the woods by something, or someone, you can't see? These aren't scenes from a horror movie. They're real experiences shared by college students who lived through them. In this video, we're diving into 5 creepy college tales. From unsettling roommates with disturbing habits to mysterious encounters in the woods and eerie late-night parties, these true stories reveal the darker, more sinister side of campus life. For Dan, it was a socially awkward freshman roommate whose behavior spiraled into something dangerous. For others, it was an innocent forest hangout or a frat party that turned into a night of terror. And then there are the stories of unexplained knocks, haunting laughter, and questions that remain unanswered to this day. What would you do if you were in their shoes? Stay tuned as we recount these chilling tales that turned college into a waking nightmare. Dan's freshman year of college began like most, full of excitement, nerves, and the hope that his roommate would become a friend for life. When he first met Dale, his assigned roommate, things seemed off. Dale extended a limp handshake and offered a quick, awkward hey, avoiding eye contact. He barely said a word during their first conversation. Dan chalked it up to nerves. After all, they were both new to campus. But Dale's behavior quickly became unsettling. That first night, Dan tried to settle into his bed early, hoping to make the most of the next day's orientation activity. But Dale stayed up late, hunched over his laptop, the faint blue glow lighting up the room. Dan assumed he was just adjusting to the new schedule, so he turned over and fell asleep. Hours later, Dan woke up with a start. He glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. When he turned his head, he saw Dale sitting upright in his chair, staring at him. At first, Dan thought Dale was joking. "Hey man," Dan said groggily, but Dale didn't respond. He just stared, his face emotionless, as if frozen in place. Dan pulled his blanket tighter and turned away, forcing himself back to sleep. Strange behaviors escalate. Over the next few days, Dale's oddities became impossible to ignore. During orientation, Dan noticed Dale rubbing his hands over the bark of a tree in the campus garden. Other students whispered and stared, but Dale seemed oblivious. "It's just something I like to do," Dale muttered when Dan asked about it later. The real turning point came when Dan returned to the dorm after class one afternoon. His laptop was open, even though he had left it closed. His desk drawers were slightly ajar, and a few of his notebooks had been moved. Dale sat on his bed, scrolling through his own phone like nothing had happened. Dan wanted to confront him but decided to let it go, unsure how Dale would react. Instead, he began locking up his belongings whenever he left the room. That night, Dan emailed the housing office, requesting a roommate reassignment. The final encounter. A week later, Dan's request was approved, and he was moved to a new dorm with a different roommate. For the first time since arriving on campus, he felt a sense of relief. But that relief didn't last. One night, around 2 a.m., Dan was jolted awake by a scratching sound at his dorm door. At first, he thought it was a prank, but as he approached the door, the scratching turned into aggressive rattling. Peeking through the peephole, Dan's stomach dropped. Dale was outside, fumbling with the doorknob, his face twisted with frustration. "Dale, what are you doing?" Dan shouted through the door, his voice shaking. Dale didn't respond. He kept jiggling the handle, his movements becoming more frantic. The aftermath. Dan grabbed his phone and called campus security. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived and escorted Dale away. He didn't resist or say a word. Dan never saw Dale again after that night. He later learned that Dale had been taken into custody for trespassing and was barred from campus housing. The incident left Dan shaken but grateful that nothing worse had happened. Years later, Dan still reflects on the experience, wondering what might have driven Dale's behavior. Was it a cry for help? Or something darker? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear. His first-year roommate was a story he would never forget. It was supposed to be a fun night. 3 friends at Binghamton University, Emma, Jason, and Mike, had decided to break away from the stress of classes and spend the evening by the lake near campus. They brought a few drinks, a flashlight, and enough snacks to last them a few hours. The lake was located on the edge of a dense forest, far from the bustle of dorm life. It was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the sound of the water lapping against the shore and the occasional rustle of leaves. As the night wore on, the group grew more relaxed, chatting and laughing as they passed around drinks. But then, around midnight, things took a turn. Jason froze mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The others fell silent, their ears straining to catch the sound. It was faint at first, like twigs snapping underfoot. "Probably an animal," Emma said with a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the unease. But the sound grew louder, and soon it wasn't just snapping twigs. It was heavy, deliberate footsteps circling their campsite. Jason grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the noise, but the beam only revealed trees and shadows. "Hello," he called out, his voice wavering. There was no response. Then, a branch flew through the air, landing just feet away from their small fire. Emma let out a startled scream, and Mike jumped to his feet. "Who's out there?" Mike shouted, but the forest remained eerily silent. Another branch came hurtling toward them, this one grazing Jason's arm. It wasn't heavy enough to hurt, but it was enough to send the group into a full-blown panic. "We need to go now," Emma said, grabbing her bag. As they hurriedly packed their belongings, the footsteps began again, louder this time, as if whoever or whatever was out there was getting closer. The group didn't wait to find out who was behind the noises. They bolted down the trail leading back to campus, their flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. Every few seconds, Jason glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing them. When they finally reached the safety of their dorm building, they collapsed onto a couch in the common area, gasping for breath. "I swear I saw someone," Jason said, his voice trembling. "They were standing by the edge of the woods, just watching us." Emma and Mike exchanged uneasy glances but didn't argue. Deep down, they knew he wasn't imagining things. The aftermath. 4 weeks after the incident, none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. On more than one occasion, they spotted a figure pacing near the woods, visible from their dorm window. They never returned to the lake after dark. Emma eventually joked that it was probably just a prank by some local kids, but the fear in her voice gave her away. Jason, however, was convinced it was something more sinister. Even years later, the memory of that night stayed with them, a chilling reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. The University of Iowa was buzzing with the usual weekend energy. For a freshman and his roommate, a Saturday night frat party seemed like the perfect way to meet new people and dive into the college social scene. They'd heard about an underground fraternity that threw wild, exclusive parties off campus. The idea of doing something a little risky, a little edgy, felt exciting, at least at first. When they arrived, the scene was far from what they'd imagined. The house was overcrowded, with people packed shoulder to shoulder in dimly lit rooms. The air was heavy with the smell of alcohol and sweat, and most of the guests seemed uninterested in mingling. It wasn't the lively, fun atmosphere they'd hoped for. "I'm not sure about this," the freshman whispered to his roommate, who shrugged and motioned toward the kitchen. While wandering through the house, a stranger approached the freshman, holding a small bottle of liquor. "Here," the stranger said, thrusting the bottle into his hand. "Drink this." The freshman hesitated, feeling a pang of unease. "I'm good, thanks," he replied, trying to hand it back. But the stranger insisted, leaning in closer. "Come on, it's just a shot. Everyone's doing it." Reluctantly, the freshman took a sip. The liquor burned going down, sharper than anything he'd ever tasted. He coughed, handing the bottle back. "There, happy?" The stranger smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something colder, something unsettling. Moments later, everything became a blur. The freshman's head felt heavy, and his vision swam. He couldn't tell if it was the alcohol or something else, but his surroundings began to fade. When he came to, he was lying on the floor of a pitch-black room. The air was stifling, and the only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards above him. Panic set in as he tried to make sense of where he was. Then he heard it, a faint noise coming from the closet. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, the sound of something or someone moving. His heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, his shaky hands fumbling for the door handle. The noise in the closet grew louder, accompanied by what sounded like muffled breathing. The door creaked open, and the freshman stumbled out into the hallway, the harsh party lights momentarily blinding him. He spotted his roommate across the room and hurried over, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "We need to leave now." His roommate, sensing the fear in his voice, didn't argue. Together, they pushed through the crowd and out into the cool night air, leaving the chaos of the party behind them. Back in the safety of their dorm room, the freshman tried to piece together what had happened. He was grateful he hadn't been harmed, but the memory of that dark room and the sounds from the closet haunted him for weeks. He vowed never to attend another shady party again, a promise he kept for the rest of his college years. Even now, he shudders at the thought of what could have happened if he'd stayed in that room a moment longer. It started with a quiet tap, tap, tap. A sophomore living in a secluded dorm room at the edge of campus didn't think much of it at first. The gentle tapping on his door one night seemed innocent enough, probably a neighbor playing a prank or someone lost on the wrong floor. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty. Shrugging it off, he locked the door and returned to his bed, chalking it up to the usual antics of dorm life. But the next night, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. The student sat up in bed, his pulse quickening. Again, he opened the door, expecting to catch someone in the act. But once again, no one was there. He stepped into the hallway, scanning both directions. It was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Not a single door opened, and not a single sound echoed in the long corridor. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, hiding just out of sight. The third night was the worst. The tapping started as usual but quickly escalated into a loud, rapid knock, knock, knock. He froze, gripping his phone tightly. This time, he didn't rush to the door. Instead, he crept toward the peephole and peeked through. For a split second, he saw a figure, a shadowy person disappearing around the corner at the end of the hallway. Determined to put an end to the harassment, the sophomore stayed alert the following night. When the tapping started again, he threw open the door and bolted down the hall. The hallway was empty, but he noticed something strange in the communal bathroom, a pair of boots visible under the stall door. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. There was no response. He hesitated, inching closer, when he heard it, soft, eerie giggling coming from the stall. He didn't wait to see who, or what, was inside. He sprinted back to his room, locking the door behind him. After that night, the tapping stopped. No one on his floor admitted to playing a prank, and no one claimed to know who was behind the noises. The boots in the bathroom, the laughter, it all remained a mystery. The student never felt fully comfortable in his dorm again. Every creak of the floorboards or gust of wind against the windows set him on edge. To this day, he wonders about the identity of the nighttime visitor. Was it a harmless prankster, or was it something far more sinister?